I knew something was wrong before I even opened the bedroom door. The hallway looked ordinary. The family photos were still hanging where I had left them 6 days earlier. My son's little sneakers were still sitting beside the front door, exactly where he had kicked them off before we left. Even the faint smell of lemon cleaner lingered in the air. But there was too much light. Sunlight spilled across the hallway from a bedroom window that should have been hidden behind a sturdy wooden bunk bed. It stretched across the floor in one long strip, brighter than I had ever seen it. I stopped walking. My son, Caleb, bumped gently into my side as he carried the small backpack he refused to travel without. It had belonged to his father. The faded blue fabric was worn around the straps, but Caleb treated it like it was made of gold. "Mom," he asked quietly. I couldn't answer. Something inside me had already begun putting impossible pieces together. I reached for the bedroom doorknob. Even now, when I think back to that moment, I remember wishing I had been wrong. I wish there had been some simple explanation waiting on the other side of that door. There wasn't. I pushed it open. The room was empty. Not messy. Not being remodeled. Empty. The bunk bed was gone. The dresser was gone. The bookshelf that my husband had built with his own hands was gone. Every toy. Every blanket. Every picture frame. Every baseball trophy. Every box of memories. Gone. Only the marks in the carpet remained where the furniture had once stood. The deep dents from the bedposts looked like footprints frozen into the floor, silent proof that something important had been ripped away. In the corner, where Caleb's reading chair had always been, sat a brand new white baby crib. Perfectly assembled. Perfectly centered. Like it had always belonged there. I heard Caleb suck in a sharp breath beside me. "Mom." His voice cracked before he could finish. I looked down at him. His eyes searched every corner of the room, as if he believed his things were simply hiding somewhere. He walked slowly to the middle of the carpet. He turned in a slow circle. Then he whispered the question that still follows me years later. "Where's Dad's room?" He didn't call it his room. He called it his father's room. Because every piece inside it carried part of the man we had lost. Before I could answer, I heard footsteps behind us. "Oh, you're back." My sister's voice carried the same cheerful tone someone might use after watering a neighbor's plants. She leaned against the hallway wall with a smile that never reached her eyes. "I wondered when you'd get home." I turned toward her without saying anything. She glanced inside the room. "Oh." She laughed softly. "You found it." Found it. As though I had stumbled across some harmless surprise. "What happened?" I finally asked. She shrugged. "I took the room." I stared at her. "You took it?" She nodded like she was explaining the weather. "Well, obviously. The baby's coming soon. We needed more space." I looked back at the crib. Then back at her. "My son's bedroom? You weren't using it." The words landed harder than I expected. "We were gone for 6 days," I said quietly. She rolled her eyes. "Exactly. You weren't here." Then she smiled. "And, honestly, you should thank me." I didn't move. She continued talking because silence seemed to make her uncomfortable. "I sold all the furniture online. You'd be surprised how much people will pay for old wood these days." She actually sounded proud. "I got a really good price." Before I could respond, another voice joined hers. "Oh, don't look so dramatic." My mother stepped into the hallway carrying a cup of coffee like this was an ordinary afternoon. "Your sister needs the room more than Caleb does." "Caleb." "Not even your son. Just Caleb. He already had everything," my mother continued. "Now it's someone else's turn." I looked at her. "What gave you the right to sell our belongings?" She sighed the way parents sometimes do when they think a child is being unreasonable. "We're family." As if those 2 words answered every question. My sister crossed her arms. "You still have the rest of the house." "The rest of the house? Don't make this bigger than it is." She pointed toward the crib. "A baby needs a nursery." I glanced down at Caleb. He hadn't said another word. He was staring at the empty corner where his father's handmade bookshelf had stood for years. His fingers tightened around the straps of his backpack until his knuckles turned white. That bookshelf hadn't been expensive. No store would have called it valuable. But my husband had spent 3 weekends building it. He had carved Caleb's initials into the bottom shelf where nobody would notice unless they knew where to look. Every birthday, we had measured Caleb's height against its side before adding another pencil mark. Those marks were gone now. Sold to someone who had no idea they existed. "I hope you aren't expecting us to replace everything," my sister said. "You'll manage." My mother nodded in agreement. Besides, forgiveness is more important than furniture. I remember looking at both of them and realizing something I should have understood years earlier. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't poor judgment. It wasn't pregnancy hormones or stress or temporary selfishness. They genuinely believed they had done nothing wrong. They expected me to be upset for a while, then forgive them, then move on. Because that's what I had always done. I had always been the one who adjusted. The one who sacrificed. The one who kept the peace. Looking back now, I understand that they weren't watching my reaction because they felt guilty. They were waiting to see how long it would take before I surrendered again. They expected tears. They expected shouting. They expected threats. Instead, I walked into the room one last time. I looked carefully around every wall. The empty screw holes where shelves had been mounted. The lighter rectangles where picture frames had blocked the sunlight. The carpet impressions beneath the missing furniture. Little details. Small things. At the time, nobody else paid attention to them. I did. Then I reached for Caleb's hand. He looked up at me with red eyes. "Are we leaving?" "Yes." "Are my things coming back?" I paused. I wanted to promise him they would. But promises should only be made when you know you can keep them. So I squeezed his hand instead. "We're going to make this right." He nodded once. That was enough. We walked past my sister. Past my mother. Neither of them tried to stop us. They simply watched us leave with the quiet confidence of people who believed they had already won. As I buckled Caleb into the car, he rested his backpack on his lap and stared out the window without speaking. I started the engine. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't call anyone. Instead, I drove away with one clear thought settling quietly into my mind. I wasn't going to argue with them. I was going to document everything. And before this was over, the empty room they laughed about would become the piece of evidence they never saw coming. The strange thing about that empty bedroom was this. It wasn't the first thing my family had taken from me. It was simply the first time they took something they couldn't explain away with a smile. When Caleb finally fell asleep that night in the small guest room at a friend's house, I sat alone at the kitchen table with my laptop open. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. I should have been crying. Instead, I found myself staring at old photographs. Looking back now, I understand why. Grief has a way of reaching for proof. It wants reminders that what you lost was real. It wants something solid to hold on to when everything else feels uncertain. So I started scrolling through years of family pictures. Not because I wanted memories. Because I needed evidence. That realization surprised even me. As each photo appeared on the screen, I noticed details I had never paid attention to before. There was Caleb's dresser in the background of his 8th birthday. There was the handmade bookshelf behind him on Christmas morning. There was the little rocking chair my husband had found at an antique shop when Caleb was only 3. Every picture quietly confirmed that those belongings had existed. That they belonged to us. That they had been inside our home. The more photographs I found, the calmer I became. People often mistake calm for weakness. My family certainly did. They thought silence meant surrender. They had no idea silence could also mean someone was thinking. After my husband, Daniel, died 4 years earlier, everyone praised me for being strong. I used to think that was a compliment. Later, I realized it often meant something else. Strong people are expected to carry more. To forgive first. To sacrifice first. To understand first. Whenever something difficult happened, people naturally turned toward the person least likely to complain. That person had always been me. At first, the requests were small. "Can your sister borrow your car for a few weeks?" "Of course." "Can you cover dinner?" "She's struggling right now." "Of course." "Could Caleb skip opening presents until everyone arrives?" Of course. Each request sounded reasonable by itself. Each sacrifice seemed too small to argue about. But they never happened in the other direction. No one asked my sister to give something up for me. No one suggested fairness when I was the one losing something. I remembered one Thanksgiving not long after Daniel's funeral. Caleb had been 6. He had carefully helped his father make a wooden centerpiece the year before. Tiny carved leaves decorated the edges. Daniel had laughed when one leaf snapped off because Caleb had glued it back on upside down. It wasn't perfect. That was exactly why we loved it. When Thanksgiving dinner ended, I couldn't find it anywhere. My sister casually mentioned she had taken it home because it matched her dining room better. My mother told me not to make a scene. It's just decoration. No, it had never been decoration. It had been one of the last things Daniel made with his son. I let it go. Because everyone insisted keeping peace mattered more than keeping things. Months later, I never saw that centerpiece again. That memory stayed with me as I continued organizing photographs on my computer. One folder became another. Birthdays, Christmas, school projects, camping trips. Every celebration accidentally documented another missing possession. Without realizing it, Daniel had spent years creating the inventory I desperately needed. My phone buzzed. Mom. I watched it ring until it stopped. A voicemail arrived seconds later. Rachel, don't be stubborn. Your sister is emotional right now. She's pregnant. This isn't the time to create family drama. I deleted the message. Another call came. This time it was my sister. I let that one go too. Then another voicemail. I know you're upset, but honestly, you're making this way bigger than it needs to be. We'll figure something out eventually. Eventually. Funny how eventually always seemed to benefit the person who caused the problem. Never the person living with the loss. The next morning, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly 2 years. His name was Thomas Avery. He had been the attorney who helped settle Daniel's estate after the accident. He answered on the second ring. Rachel, it's been a while. It has. I wish we were talking under better circumstances. So do I. He listened quietly while I explained everything. I expected surprise. Instead, there was a long silence. Finally, he asked one question. Did you give anyone permission to remove or sell the property? No. Any written agreement? No. Any verbal agreement? No. Another pause. Then his voice became calm. Very calm. Rachel, I need you to listen carefully. I grabbed a notebook. Don't contact buyers yet. I wasn't planning to. Good. Don't confront your family anymore. I won't. And don't post about this online. That surprised me. Why not? Because right now, you're gathering facts. Facts are stronger when they're untouched. I wrote every word down. What should I do? Document everything. The same words that had been circling in my own mind all night. He continued. Photographs. I wrote. Insurance records. I wrote again. Receipts. Another note. Old videos. I nodded. Anything showing ownership before the property disappeared. What if I can't remember everything that was in the room? You don't have to. I don't. No. His voice remained steady. The evidence will remember for you. That sentence stayed with me. The evidence will remember for you. Not emotions. Not arguments. Not opinions. Evidence. For the next several hours, I searched through old insurance paperwork stored in a filing cabinet Daniel insisted on organizing every January. At the time, I used to tease him for being overly careful. Now I silently thanked him. Every expensive item had been photographed years earlier for insurance purposes. The bedroom furniture. The electronics. The antique clock Daniel inherited from his grandfather. Even the custom-built bookshelf. One by one, I scanned every document. Then I found another folder. Home inventory. Inside were serial numbers. Purchase dates. Descriptions. Estimated values. Daniel had labeled everything in his neat handwriting. It felt like he was still helping us. Even after all those years. Caleb wandered into the room rubbing his eyes. Mom? Morning, sweetheart. He looked at the growing stack of papers. What are you doing? I smiled gently. I'm finding our things. He frowned. But they're gone. For now. He thought about that. Are we getting them back? I looked at him. I don't know if we'll get everything back. He lowered his head. But we're going to find the truth. He nodded slowly. Children understand honesty better than false promises. He walked over beside me. Without saying another word, he picked up an old photo album. Together, we turned page after page. Each picture revealed another piece of our missing home. Then something caught my eye. A photograph from Caleb's 9th birthday. In the background, sitting on the bookshelf almost hidden behind balloons, was a small wooden box. I hadn't thought about that box in years. Daniel kept important papers inside it. Letters. Old sketches. Little projects he never finished. I quickly zoomed in. The box was definitely there. But now I couldn't remember seeing it among the missing items. I opened another folder. Then another. Every later photograph showed the same box sitting on the same shelf. Until 6 days ago. I leaned back in my chair. Something important had been inside that room. Something I hadn't even remembered was missing. And, suddenly, I had a feeling that whoever bought our furniture hadn't purchased the most valuable thing my husband had left behind. The first person who answered my message apologized before I even finished introducing myself. I hadn't expected that. After everything that had happened inside my own family, I had almost forgotten strangers could choose kindness without being asked. Thomas had advised me to move slowly. Let the evidence lead you, he told me. Don't let your emotions outrun the facts. So that was exactly what I did. Using the online marketplace records, old screenshots, and the timestamps attached to each listing, I started making a list of every item that had been sold while Caleb and I were away. There were more than I wanted to count. The bunk bed, the dresser, the bookshelf, the rocking chair, several storage boxes, a small desk. Even the lamp Daniel had repaired 3 different times because Caleb refused to sleep without it. Each listing showed the same seller account. My sister hadn't even tried to hide what she was doing. She simply assumed nobody would question her. She assumed I would come home, be upset for a few days, and then quietly move on like I always had. She didn't know I had finally reached the point where moving on without accountability was no longer an option. The first buyer lived less than 30 minutes away. His name was Mr. Collins. When I called, I kept my voice calm. Hello, sir. My name is Rachel. I'm calling about a wooden dresser you purchased last week. There was a short pause. Yes, I believe it belonged to my son. Silence. Then I carefully explained what had happened. I didn't accuse him. I didn't demand anything. I simply told him the truth. When I finished, he let out a long breath. Oh, that one word carried more compassion than anything I had heard from my own family. I had no idea. I didn't think you did. I bought it because the seller said she was downsizing before the baby arrived. I closed my eyes for a moment. The lie had traveled even farther than the furniture. I'm so sorry, he continued. If I'd known, I never would have touched it. We arranged to meet that afternoon. When Caleb and I pulled into his driveway, the dresser was already sitting outside his garage, clean, covered with a blanket to protect it from the sun. Mr. Collins walked toward us before we even stepped out of the car. I'm terribly sorry. You don't owe me an apology. He shook his head. I still feel awful. Then he surprised me. I'd like you to have your money back too. I looked at him confused. What money? The amount I paid. You already paid once. I know. I can't ask you to lose that. He smiled gently. Ma'am, I'd lose a lot more if I kept something that belongs to a little boy. I stood there for a second, unable to answer. Kindness has a way of catching you off guard after you've spent too much time expecting the opposite. I thanked him. He refused every offer of repayment. As we loaded the dresser into the truck, Caleb quietly ran his fingers across one of the drawers. Dad fixed this handle. He whispered it more to himself than anyone else. Mr. Collins heard him anyway. His face fell. I'm even more glad it's going home. As we drove away, Caleb looked back through the rear window until the house disappeared. Not everybody lies. No, I said softly. They don't. That afternoon gave us something I hadn't realized we were missing. Hope. Not hope that everything would magically return. Hope that there were still decent people in the world. Over the next week, I contacted more buyers. Every conversation was different, but almost every ending was the same. People listened. People cared. One young couple returned a rocking chair they had planned to repaint for their nursery. We'll find another one, the wife said. This one already has a family. An older man brought back several boxes of books. He refused gas money. My father taught me something years ago, he said. If something enters your house the wrong way, it never really belongs there. Another woman returned a handmade quilt after learning Daniel's grandmother had sewn every square herself. She held it carefully before handing it to me. I thought it was beautiful before, she said. Now I know why. Not everyone could return what they had purchased. Some furniture had already been resold. Some items had been damaged. A few buyers couldn't be located at all. Every loss still hurt. But each recovered piece reminded Caleb that not everyone chose selfishness when given the chance. Meanwhile, Thomas stayed in close contact. Document every recovery. I am. Photographs. Already done. Names. Recorded. Conversations. I've written summaries. Good. His calm confidence never changed. He reminded me that every returned item confirmed two important facts. First, the property had belonged to us. Second, someone else had sold it without permission. The evidence was slowly building itself. One Saturday morning, we drove nearly 2 hours to meet an elderly couple who had purchased Daniel's old wooden toolbox. When they opened their garage, I recognized it immediately. The scratches along the side. The worn leather handle. Even the tiny burn mark on one corner from the summer Daniel accidentally set down a hot soldering iron. Mrs. Bennet smiled warmly. My husband couldn't stop talking about your phone call. Her husband nodded. I've carried this toolbox around my garage all week. He looked at Caleb. I don't think it ever belonged to me. He gently placed it into Caleb's hands. My son held it like he was afraid it might disappear again. Then something unexpected happened. Mr. Bennet looked at me. Would you mind opening it? I frowned. It should be empty. It isn't. I slowly lifted the lid. Inside were a few old screws. A measuring tape. Several pencils. Nothing unusual. Then I noticed something tucked beneath the removable tray. A folded envelope. Yellow with age. My heart skipped. I carefully pulled it free. Daniel's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. It wasn't a letter. It was a rough sketch. Then another. Then several more pages folded together. I unfolded the stack with trembling hands. Wood measurements. Curved lines. Construction notes. Tiny handwritten corrections. Across the top of the first page, Daniel had written 3 simple words. Sailboat project, final plans. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Before Daniel died, he and Caleb had spent weekends talking about building a small wooden sailboat together. Not one they could sail across the ocean. Just a simple handcrafted boat for the lake where we spent every summer. They had started planning it. Then life ended before the project ever could. I had searched everywhere for those drawings after the funeral. We never found them. Until now. They had been hidden beneath the toolbox tray all along. Caleb stared at the pages. Dad drew these. I nodded. Yes. He carefully traced one line with his finger. Does this mean? His voice became hopeful for the first time in days. We can still build it. I couldn't answer right away. Not because I didn't want to. Because I suddenly realized Daniel had found one final way to keep a promise he never got the chance to finish. I smiled through tears. Yes. I think we can. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet quietly stepped away to give us privacy. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Some moments become too important for words. As we drove home, Caleb kept the folded plans resting carefully on his lap the entire trip. He checked every few minutes to make sure they were still there. That evening, I scanned every page before placing the originals into a protective folder. Those drawings weren't simply blueprints anymore. They were proof that some things survive even when people don't. The next morning, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't Thomas. It was the investigator assigned to review our growing case. His voice was calm. "Mrs. Hayes?" "Yes. I've finished reviewing the documents you've submitted." I waited. He continued. "I want you to understand something." "What is it?" "This is no longer looking like a misunderstanding between family members." My stomach tightened. He paused before speaking again. "It's becoming something much more serious." The phone calls changed the moment the official letters arrived. Up until then, my family had acted like I was having an emotional reaction that would eventually fade away. They spoke with the confidence of people who believed time would solve everything. But paperwork has a way of making reality impossible to ignore. The investigator had officially opened the case. Statements were being collected. Records were being reviewed. Buyers were being interviewed. And for the first time, my family realized this wasn't something they could simply talk their way out of. The first call came from my mother. She didn't even say hello. "Rachel, what have you done?" I looked out the kitchen window before answering. I told the truth. "You called the police on your own sister." "No. I reported stolen property." "That's the same thing." "No," I replied quietly. "It isn't." She let out a frustrated sigh. "You know exactly what I mean." I did. She wasn't upset because something wrong had happened. She was upset because someone outside the family had been invited to see it. For years, every problem had stayed inside the house. Every argument had ended with someone saying, "We're family." Those words had become a shield. Not for protecting people, for protecting bad behavior. My mother lowered her voice. "Your sister is pregnant." "I know. She's under enough stress already." "I didn't create this situation." "You're making it worse." I closed my eyes for a second. Looking back now, I noticed something strange about every conversation we had during those weeks. Nobody asked how Caleb was doing. Nobody asked what it felt like for him to lose his room. Nobody apologized for selling the last belongings his father had left behind. Every discussion focused on one thing: my sister. Her stress. Her feelings. Her future. It was as though my son had disappeared from the story completely. That hurt more than I expected. "I have to go," I said. "Rachel," I ended the call. About an hour later, my sister showed up at the temporary apartment Caleb and I had rented. She didn't knock. She pounded on the door hard enough to make the walls shake. When I opened it, she pushed past me before I could say anything. "This has gone far enough." Her voice echoed through the living room. Caleb looked up from the dining table where he was doing homework. I gently nodded toward his bedroom. "Why don't you finish your reading in there?" He understood immediately. Without asking questions, he picked up his book and quietly closed the door behind him. I turned back toward my sister. "What do you want?" "What do I want?" She laughed. "I want you to stop acting like I robbed a bank. You sold our belongings." "I sold furniture." "You sold property that didn't belong to you." She threw her hands into the air. "It was just stuff." I looked at her carefully. "No, it was." "It wasn't." She stepped closer. "You're seriously trying to destroy my life over an old bedroom?" I didn't raise my voice. "I'm trying to teach my son that people are responsible for what they do." For a moment, she simply stared at me. Then she laughed again. "Oh, please. He's a kid. He'll get over it." Those 6 words settled into the room like heavy stones. He'll get over it. Maybe. Children often survive painful things. That doesn't mean adults should create them. My sister crossed her arms. "You've always thought you were better than everyone." That surprised me. "I never said that." "You don't have to. You act like you're perfect." I almost smiled. If only she knew how many nights I questioned every decision I made. How often I wondered whether I was failing as a mother. How many times I wished Daniel were still here to help me carry the weight. Perfection had never entered my mind. Responsibility had. "You can still stop this," she said. "Withdraw the complaint." "No." "Seriously?" "No." Her expression changed. The anger slowly disappeared. In its place came something I hadn't expected. Tears. Or at least something that looked like tears. My baby hasn't even been born yet. She wiped beneath her eyes. Do you really want your niece or nephew growing up with a mother who has a criminal record? The question sounded powerful. Until I thought about it. Then I answered quietly. I wanted my son to grow up with his father. Silence. Not because I was trying to win the conversation. Because there was nothing else to say. Daniel wasn't coming home. Nothing anyone did could change that. The least they could have done was respect what he left behind. My sister stared at me for several long seconds. Then she grabbed her purse. You'll regret this. I don't think I will. She walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned back. When Mom finds out you refuse to help me, don't expect anyone to be on your side. The door slammed behind her. The apartment became quiet again. A few seconds later, Caleb stepped carefully into the hallway. Is she gone? Yes. He studied my face. Are you okay? I smiled. I will be. He nodded. I don't like yelling. Neither do I. He thought for a moment. Did I do something wrong? That question broke my heart. Children have a terrible habit of blaming themselves for problems adults create. I knelt beside him. Listen to me. He looked straight into my eyes. You did absolutely nothing wrong. Then why is everybody mad? I took a slow breath. Sometimes people become angry when someone refuses to pretend something unfair is okay. He was quiet. So, we're telling the truth? Yes. Even if people don't like it? Especially then. He nodded slowly. I think Dad would have done that. I felt tears threaten for the first time since this all began. I think he would have too. That evening, Thomas called to update me. The interviews are moving forward. How are they going? He hesitated. Interesting. That's not usually a good sign. It depends on which side you're on. I waited. The statements don't match. I leaned forward. What do you mean? Your mother says you gave permission. I didn't. Your sister says your mother told her she had permission. She didn't. Another relative says the furniture was abandoned. I almost laughed. Abandoned? Thomas sighed softly. Rachel, when several people tell different versions of the same story, investigators start asking different kinds of questions. He explained that every interview had created new contradictions. One person claimed the furniture had been gifted. Another claimed it had been stored. Someone else insisted it had almost no value. Yet online listings described every piece as excellent condition, well cared for, and worth premium pricing. Their own advertisements contradicted their excuses. You don't have to prove they're lying anymore, Thomas said. They're doing that themselves. After we hung up, I sat quietly thinking about those words. I realized something important. I hadn't forced anyone to make false statements. I hadn't encouraged anyone to invent excuses. Every new problem existed because they kept trying to avoid one simple sentence. We were wrong. Those 3 words could have changed everything weeks earlier. Instead, every attempt to escape responsibility created another piece of evidence. Days later, another wave of phone calls began. This time they came from extended family. An aunt. A cousin. An uncle I hadn't spoken to in nearly a year. Every conversation followed almost the same pattern. Can't you just forgive her? Families shouldn't sue each other. Think about the baby. Think about your mother. Nobody asked me to think about Caleb. Nobody mentioned Daniel. Nobody asked whether selling another person's belongings might have been wrong in the first place. Forgiveness had become everyone's favorite word. Responsibility never entered the conversation. One evening, after another exhausting call, Caleb found me sitting quietly on the back steps outside the apartment. He sat beside me without speaking. We watched the sun disappear behind the trees. Finally, he asked something so simple it stopped every racing thought in my mind. Mom? Yes. If somebody breaks the rules, but nobody ever tells them they broke the rules. He looked down at his shoes. How do they learn? I wrapped my arm around his shoulders. They don't. He nodded slowly. I don't want to grow up like that. His words settled deep inside me. In that moment, I understood this case had stopped being about furniture a long time ago. It wasn't even about money anymore. It was about the lesson my son would carry into the rest of his life. Would he believe that the strongest person should always give up everything to keep everyone else happy? Or would he learn that kindness and boundaries could exist together? That answer mattered far more than any courtroom ever could. The next morning, Thomas called again. His voice carried the calm confidence I had come to trust. They've completed another review of the financial records. What did they find? A complete trail. What kind of trail? He paused just long enough for me to understand that whatever came next would change everything. They now know exactly where the money from every single sale went. The day of the hearing arrived much more quietly than I had imagined. There were no dramatic speeches waiting outside the courthouse. No television cameras. No shouting crowds. Just ordinary people walking through metal detectors, carrying folders, coffee cups, and worries of their own. Looking back now, I think that was fitting. The biggest moments in life rarely announce themselves. They simply arrive. I held Caleb's hand as we walked through the front doors. He looked up at the tall ceilings and polished floors. "Have you ever been here before?" he whispered. "Only once." "Were you scared then too?" I smiled honestly. "Yes." He squeezed my hand. "So am I. We'll get through it together." Thomas met us near the courtroom entrance. He carried the same leather briefcase I remembered from years earlier when he helped settle Daniel's estate. He greeted Caleb first. "Good morning, young man." "Morning." Thomas smiled. "You ready?" Caleb nodded. "I think so." Then Thomas looked at me. "Everything's in order. I trust you." He handed me a neatly organized binder. Inside were copies of every document we had collected over the past several weeks. Insurance records, marketplace listings, receipts, photographs, time-stamped messages, statements from buyers. Every page represented another piece of the truth. I flipped through them slowly. It amazed me how ordinary they looked. Plain paper, black ink, simple facts. Yet together, they told a story no excuse could erase. Across the hallway, I saw my mother and sister arrive. They didn't look at me. Instead, they gathered with several relatives who had come to support them. A few glanced in my direction before quickly looking away. Months earlier, I probably would have worried about what they thought. Not anymore. I wasn't there to win anyone's approval. I was there because my son deserved to know that truth mattered. The courtroom itself felt smaller than I expected. Rows of wooden benches stretched toward the front where the judge would sit. People spoke in quiet voices. Papers shuffled. A clerk called names. Everything felt calm. Almost too calm. Until the hearing began. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Then we sat. The first part moved slowly. Names were confirmed. Documents were introduced. Procedures were explained. No one raised their voice. No one tried to create drama. The facts were doing enough work on their own. The investigator testified first. He explained how the complaint had been filed. Then he described the timeline. The reporting party left the residence on June 12th. He referred to me only by title. The property was removed during the following 6 days. He continued outlining dates, photographs, interviews, recovered items. Every statement matched the records we had collected. Then Thomas presented the online marketplace evidence. Large photographs appeared on a screen for everyone to see. There was Caleb's bunk bed, the dresser, the bookshelf Daniel had built, the rocking chair. Each listing included dates and prices. One by one, buyers were called to speak. Mr. Collins testified first. He explained how he had purchased the dresser believing it belonged to the seller. "When did you first learn otherwise?" Thomas asked. "When Mrs. Hayes contacted me." "What did you do?" "I returned it." "Why?" Mr. Collins looked toward me briefly before answering. "Because it wasn't mine." Simple. Honest. Nothing more needed to be said. Next came Mrs. Bennett. She described buying Daniel's toolbox. Then she explained how she and her husband immediately returned it after learning the truth. Thomas asked one final question. "Did Mrs. Hayes threaten you or pressure you to return the item?" "No." "What did she do?" "She simply told us what had happened." Mrs. Bennett smiled gently. "We made our own decision." Witness after witness told nearly identical stories. Nobody claimed I had demanded anything. Nobody suggested I exaggerated. The truth had spoken for itself. Then the financial records were introduced. The investigator explained that payment histories from the marketplace had been matched with bank deposits. Every sale, every transfer, every dollar. A complete record. There was no confusion anymore. Only a timeline. My sister's attorney stood and argued that everything had been misunderstood. He suggested the furniture had been shared family property. Thomas calmly opened another folder. "Your Honor, may I direct attention to Exhibit 27? The judge nodded. Thomas displayed Daniel's insurance inventory. Every item had been documented years before. Ownership, purchase dates, serial numbers, photographs. The records left little room for argument. The attorney changed direction. He suggested the items had little financial value. Thomas responded without changing his tone. "The issue before the court isn't whether the property was expensive." He paused. "It's whether it belonged to someone else." The courtroom became very quiet. Even people sitting in the back stopped moving. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something shift. Not because anyone praised me, because nobody could honestly deny what had happened anymore. Then something unexpected occurred. The judge looked toward Caleb. "Young man," he said kindly, "I understand you would like to make a brief statement." Thomas had prepared us for this possibility. Only if Caleb wanted to. Only if he felt ready. I looked at my son. He looked back at me. I gave one small nod. He stood. His hands trembled just a little. He wasn't there to accuse anyone. He wasn't there to ask for punishment. He simply spoke the truth. "My dad built my bookshelf." His voice was soft. "We used to measure how tall I was on the side." He swallowed. "I thought maybe, when I grew up, I'd measure my own kids there too." Silence filled the room. He looked down for a second before continuing. "I don't really care about getting new furniture." Another pause. "I just wanted the things my dad touched." No tears. No dramatic speech. Just 12 simple words that carried more weight than anything said that morning. When he sat down beside me, I quietly squeezed his shoulder. I didn't say I was proud. He already knew. Across the room, I noticed several people wiping their eyes. Even the court reporter paused for just a second before continuing to type. My sister stared at the table in front of her. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't talking. She wasn't explaining. She wasn't arguing. She simply sat in silence. Her attorney made one final attempt. He spoke about family relationships, miscommunication, stress, pregnancy, good intentions. When he finished, Thomas stood one last time. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't need to. This case is not about family disagreements. He looked toward the evidence stacked neatly before the judge. It is about ownership. He rested one hand on the binder. It is about consent. Then he paused. And it is about whether being related to someone gives you permission to take what is not yours. No one answered. Because there wasn't an answer. The judge thanked both attorneys and announced a short recess before reviewing the remaining exhibits. People slowly stood. The room filled with quiet conversations. No one laughed. No one whispered about me anymore. Something had changed. The truth had reached every corner of that courtroom. As we stepped into the hallway, Caleb tugged gently on my sleeve. "Mom?" "Yes." "Do you think Dad would have been proud today?" I looked at him for a long moment. I don't think he could have been any prouder. He smiled. It was the first real smile I had seen on his face since we came home to that empty bedroom. Across the hallway, my mother looked like she wanted to come over. She took one step, then stopped. She seemed to realize there were no more speeches left to give. No more excuses strong enough to erase what everyone had just witnessed. A few minutes later, the courtroom clerk opened the doors again. Everyone returned to their seats. The judge looked down at the stack of evidence one final time before speaking. "The court will recess briefly before issuing its final decision." And in that quiet moment, I realized that after weeks of accusations, excuses, and manipulation, The next words spoken inside that courtroom would no longer come from my family. They would come from the only voice that mattered. The courtroom was so quiet that I could hear the soft turning of a single page. Everyone had returned to their seats. The judge adjusted a pair of reading glasses, looked down at the stack of documents one final time, and then looked across the room. No one spoke. Not my sister. Not my mother. Not the attorneys. Not even the people sitting in the back row. It felt as though the entire room was holding the same breath. Looking back now, I realize I wasn't waiting to hear whether we had won. That wasn't what mattered anymore. The truth had already been seen. Whatever happened next would simply give it a name. The judge began reading the decision in a calm, measured voice. He summarized the evidence one piece at a time. The insurance records, the marketplace listings, the recovered property, the buyer testimony, the financial records, the inconsistent statements made during the investigation. Nothing sounded dramatic. Everything sounded factual. And somehow, that made it even more powerful. When he finished reviewing the evidence, he paused. Then he spoke the words my family had refused to say from the very beginning. The court finds that the property was removed and sold without the owner's authorization. I closed my eyes for one brief moment. Not because I felt victorious. Because someone in authority had finally said out loud what Caleb and I had known from the day we opened that bedroom door. The judge continued. He ordered restitution for the property that had not been recovered. He ordered repayment based on the documented value of the missing items. He outlined additional legal consequences for the unlawful sale of property, including probation and other conditions required by law. Each sentence was delivered without emotion. Justice doesn't need anger. It only needs truth. I glanced toward my sister. She stared straight ahead. The confidence she had carried for weeks was gone. Her shoulders looked smaller somehow. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. For the first time since this began, she wasn't trying to explain herself. She wasn't interrupting. She wasn't asking anyone to understand her. She simply listened. My mother lowered her head. She looked older than I remembered. Not because of the ruling. Because reality had finally reached a place that excuses could no longer protect. The judge wasn't finished. He spoke directly to both parties. This court recognizes that family disputes are often emotionally difficult. He paused. However, family relationships do not eliminate individual property rights. Another short pause. In fact, trust within a family makes violations of those rights especially serious. No one argued. There was nothing left to argue about. When the hearing officially ended, people slowly began standing. Some gathered their paperwork. Others quietly left the courtroom. Thomas turned toward me. "It's over." I nodded. "Thank you." He smiled gently. "You did the hardest part. I just told the truth. And you kept telling it. There is a difference. Sometimes telling the truth once is easy. Continuing to tell it after people pressure you to stop is much harder." As we walked into the hallway, Caleb looked up at me. "Does this mean it's finished?" I thought carefully before answering. "The case is finished. But not everything else?" "No." He nodded. "I think I understand." Children often understand more than adults give them credit for. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun felt warmer than I expected. For the first time in weeks, I noticed the breeze. I noticed birds in the trees. I noticed ordinary life continuing around us. Cars passed. People laughed somewhere across the street. The world hadn't stopped because our family had broken apart. Life kept moving. And somehow, that gave me comfort. As Thomas walked toward his car, he stopped beside me one last time. "I have one piece of advice." "I'm listening." "When the phone starts ringing again." I smiled slightly. "You think it will?" "I know it will." He adjusted his briefcase. "Remember that you don't owe anyone a different answer simply because they ask the same question louder." I laughed softly. That was exactly the kind of practical wisdom Daniel used to appreciate. "I'll remember." He shook my hand. Then he left. He had guided us through the legal process. The rest would be up to us. I hadn't even reached the parking lot before my phone buzzed. "Mom." I stared at the screen for a few seconds before answering. Hello. She didn't speak immediately. When she finally did, her voice sounded tired. It didn't have to end like this. I leaned against the side of my car. It didn't. Another silence. We can still fix this. I hope someday we can. Relief entered her voice. So you'll come home? I looked at Caleb, who was carefully buckling himself into his seat. No. The relief disappeared. What do you mean? I mean we're not moving back. But that's your family. I took a slow breath. My family sold my son's room while we were away. They made a mistake. They made a choice. You can't throw away your whole family over one bad decision. I thought about that. Then I answered as honestly as I could. I'm not walking away because of one decision. She became quiet. I'm walking away because nobody thought it was wrong until a judge said it was. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. I wasn't trying to hurt her. I simply wasn't willing to pretend anymore. She spoke again. What if your sister apologizes? I hope she does. And then, if she truly accepts responsibility, I hope she finds peace. That's not what I asked. I know. She sighed. So, that's it? I looked toward the courthouse one final time. No. What do you mean? This is the beginning. The beginning of what? A healthier life. She didn't answer. Eventually she whispered goodbye. Then the call ended. I sat in the driver's seat for several minutes before starting the engine. Not because I doubted my decision. Because I understood what it cost. Setting boundaries always costs something. Sometimes it costs comfort. Sometimes it costs familiar relationships. Sometimes it costs the version of your family you spent years hoping would someday exist. But there is another cost people rarely talk about. The cost of never setting boundaries. I had already paid that price for years. I wasn't asking Caleb to pay it too. Over the next several weeks, paperwork continued arriving in the mail. Restitution schedules. Property recovery updates. Official documents confirming the court's orders. Each envelope marked another step toward closing a painful chapter. Some recovered belongings slowly came home. Others never would. That still hurt. No amount of money could replace certain memories. But restitution had never been about replacing memories. It had been about acknowledging that they mattered. One afternoon, Caleb and I returned to the house for the first time since leaving. Not to stay. Only to collect the few personal belongings that had remained untouched. The bedroom still looked different. The crib was gone now. So were most of my sister's things. The room stood nearly empty again. Strangely, it no longer felt like the place where everything had been taken. It felt like a blank page. A place waiting for a new beginning. Caleb stood quietly in the doorway. I think I want a different room someday. I smiled. I think that's a good idea. I don't want this one anymore. You don't have to keep it. He looked around one last time. It doesn't feel like Dad's room now. No, it doesn't. As we left the house, I didn't look back. Not because I hated it. Because I finally understood that home had never been defined by four walls. It was defined by the people who protected one another inside them. That evening, while organizing another folder of recovered documents, I noticed something tucked beneath the protective sleeve holding Daniel's sailboat plans. A small handwritten note. Just one sentence. In Daniel's familiar handwriting, it read, "One day, we'll finish this together." I held the note for a long time. Then I smiled. Because I suddenly realized that while the courtroom had closed one chapter of our lives, another promise had quietly been waiting for us all along. The first piece of wood we cut wasn't for a boat. It was for a bookshelf. A simple one. Nothing fancy. Just wide enough to hold Caleb's favorite books and a few framed photographs. When I handed him the measuring tape, he smiled in a way I hadn't seen for a long time. It wasn't the smile of a child who had forgotten what happened. It was the smile of a child who finally believed life could move forward. That mattered more than I can explain. By then, several months had passed since the hearing. Life had settled into a quieter rhythm. The phone calls from relatives had almost stopped. The letters from the court became less frequent. The hardest days were behind us. Not because everything had been repaired, because we had stopped waiting for the people who broke things to fix them. We rented a small house across town. It wasn't as large as the old family home. The kitchen was smaller. The backyard was uneven. The paint in the hallway needed work. But every room belonged to us. No one had a key except Caleb and me. For the first time in years, I slept without wondering what someone might decide to take while I wasn't looking. Peace is difficult to describe. Sometimes it doesn't feel exciting. Sometimes it simply feels quiet. And after everything we had lived through, quiet became one of my favorite sounds. Restitution payments began arriving according to the court's schedule. They weren't large. They weren't immediate. But they represented something far greater than money. Each payment acknowledged the same truth. What happened was wrong. No amount of money could replace Daniel's handwriting. No check could restore the pencil marks that had once measured Caleb's height on the old bookshelf. But accountability has value even when restoration is incomplete. Little by little, recovered belongings found their way back into our lives. The antique clock Daniel inherited from his grandfather came home after another buyer learned about the case. The handmade quilt returned from professional cleaning after the woman who purchased it insisted it deserved to be preserved. Several boxes of books arrived one afternoon with a handwritten note tucked inside. I hope these stories continue where they belong. There was no signature, just kindness. Caleb carefully placed every recovered item inside his new room. He never rushed. Every object seemed to receive its own quiet welcome home. Sometimes he simply sat on the floor looking at them. Not because they were expensive. Because they connected him to memories no one could sell. One Saturday morning, while organizing the garage, he carried out the protective folder holding Daniel's sailboat plans. He placed it carefully on the workbench. Then he looked at me. Are we ready? I knew exactly what he meant. I opened the folder. The pages still smelled faintly of old paper and sawdust. Daniel's handwriting filled every corner. Measurements. Sketches. Tiny notes reminding himself to sand one edge before attaching another. In the margin of one page, he had written something that made me smile. Let Caleb choose the paint. I laughed quietly. He was planning ahead. Caleb grinned. Dad already knew I'd want the fun part. He knew you very well. We spent the next hour reading every page together. Neither of us had ever built a sailboat before. Daniel had left detailed instructions, but there were still questions. So we did what he would have done. We learned. We borrowed books from the library. We watched woodworking demonstrations. We spoke with a retired carpenter who volunteered at the local community workshop. His name was Mr. Hernandez. After looking through Daniel's drawings, he smiled. Whoever made these knew what they were doing. My husband. He left you a good map. We've never built anything like this. He closed the folder gently. You don't have to build it perfectly. I looked at him. Really? He nodded. You only have to build it with love. That sounded exactly like something Daniel would have said. Every Saturday became workshop day. Some weeks we made real progress. Other weeks we measured the same board 3 times before deciding to start over. There were mistakes. Plenty of them. One afternoon Caleb accidentally cut a piece too short. He looked devastated. I ruined it. I smiled. No, but we can't use it. Then we'll make another. He frowned. Won't Dad be disappointed? I rested a hand on his shoulder. Your dad wasn't afraid of mistakes. He wasn't. I laughed softly. Sweetheart, your father once built an entire garden gate backwards. Caleb's eyes widened. He did. He certainly did. What happened? He laughed. So, what do we do? We laugh. And we did. For the first time in a very long while, our garage echoed with laughter instead of silence. Slowly, piece by piece, the sailboat began taking shape. The curved frame. The wooden ribs. The smooth sides. Every finished section felt like another conversation with Daniel. Sometimes I caught myself looking toward the garage door, almost expecting him to walk inside carrying another bundle of lumber. Grief never disappears completely. It simply changes. It becomes less about saying goodbye, more about carrying someone forward. One evening, after we finished sanding part of the hull, Caleb sat beside me on the garage floor. Mom? Yes. Do you think Dad can see this? I thought carefully before answering. I don't know exactly how those things work. He nodded. But I know something. What? I think the love he gave us is still here. Caleb looked around the garage, then at the unfinished boat. I feel that too. Those words stayed with me. Months earlier, I had believed rebuilding meant replacing what was stolen. I was wrong. Replacing furniture was easy. Rebuilding trust inside a child's heart took much longer. Fortunately, it was happening one quiet Saturday at a time. Around the same period, I received the final restitution payment. The paperwork confirmed that every legal requirement ordered by the court had been completed. I placed the documents inside a file cabinet. Then I closed the drawer. Not because I wanted to forget. Because I no longer needed to carry them every day. Justice had done its work. Healing would take care of the rest. The following spring, the sailboat was finally finished. It wasn't perfect. One side curved just a little differently than the other. The paint wasn't flawless. If you looked closely, you could find tiny imperfections almost everywhere. Daniel would have loved every single one of them. We loaded the boat onto a small trailer and drove to the same lake where he had once promised Caleb they would sail together. The morning air felt cool. The water was perfectly still. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. We simply carried the boat to the shoreline. Together. Just like Daniel had imagined. Before pushing it into the water, Caleb reached into his pocket. He unfolded the little note we had found with the sailboat plans. The one that read, "One day, we'll finish this together." He looked at the handwriting for a long moment, then carefully folded it again. "We did it, Dad." His voice barely rose above a whisper. I placed my hand on his shoulder. "Yes, we did." We gently pushed the sailboat into the water. For a moment, it floated quietly near the shore. Then the breeze caught the small white sail. Slowly, gracefully, it began moving across the lake. Neither of us chased after it. Neither of us cried loudly. We simply stood there watching it carry a promise that had once seemed impossible to keep. In that moment, I finally understood something I wish I had known years earlier. My family had managed to take furniture. They had managed to sell keepsakes. They had even managed to divide people who once shared the same home. But they had never possessed the one thing that mattered most. They could not steal the love Daniel left behind. They could not sell the lessons he taught his son. And they could never take away the future Caleb and I chose to build together. People still ask me whether it was worth it. Sometimes the question comes from neighbors who only heard pieces of the story. Sometimes it comes from old friends who can't understand why I no longer attend certain family gatherings. And every once in a while, it comes from someone who has lived through something painfully similar. They usually ask it the same way. Was it really worth losing your family over a bedroom? I always give them the same answer. It was never about the bedroom. Not really. The bedroom was simply the place where years of unhealthy patterns finally became impossible to ignore. Looking back now, I can see those patterns much more clearly than I could while I was living inside them. For a long time, I believed love meant saying yes. Yes to one more sacrifice. Yes to one more compromise. Yes to one more excuse. I believed keeping peace was the same thing as protecting my family. But peace built on silence isn't really peace. It's permission. Every time I accepted behavior that hurt us, I unintentionally taught the people around me that there would never be consequences. More importantly, I taught my son something I never wanted him to learn. That the strongest person in the room should always be the one who gives up the most. The day I realized Caleb had started believing that was the day everything changed. I still remember the question he asked while we were sitting outside the apartment. If nobody tells people they broke the rules, how do they learn? Children have a remarkable way of finding the heart of a problem. He wasn't really asking about rules. He was asking about responsibility. And I knew my answer would shape the kind of man he would someday become. I wanted him to grow up kind. But I also wanted him to understand that kindness and self-respect belong together. One should never require sacrificing the other. Our lives look very different now. The little house we rented eventually became a home in every sense of the word. We planted flowers in the front yard together. Every spring, Caleb insists on growing sunflowers because Daniel loved them. They're never perfectly straight. Some lean toward the fence. Others grow taller than expected. We leave them exactly as they are. Not everything beautiful has to be perfect. Caleb is older now. He still keeps the small blue backpack his father gave him. It hangs beside his bedroom door. Not because he needs it anymore. Because some things remind us where we've been. The rebuilt bookshelf stands against one wall of his room. It isn't an exact copy of the original. We didn't try to make it one. Instead, we carved something new into the bottom shelf. Not just Caleb's initials. Mine too. It reminds us that we built this chapter of our lives together. The sailboat rests on a wooden stand in the garage during the winter months. Every summer, we take it back to the lake. Each trip feels a little different. The sadness grows quieter. The gratitude grows stronger. Sometimes we simply sit on the dock and watch the water. We don't always talk. We don't have to. Healing doesn't always sound like conversation. Sometimes it sounds like comfortable silence. People often wonder what happened to the rest of my family. The answer isn't simple. Some relationships ended completely. Others changed slowly over time. A few relatives eventually apologized. Not because a court told them to. Because they finally understood the damage that had been done. Real apologies are different from requests to move on. They don't ask you to forget. They don't demand immediate forgiveness. They simply accept responsibility without asking for a reward. Those are the only apologies that can begin rebuilding trust. As for my mother, our conversations became rare. They were polite, careful, respectful. But something had changed forever. For years, she believed protecting the family meant protecting whoever caused the conflict. I believed protecting the family meant protecting the people who were harmed. Those two ideas could never exist in the same place. I don't hate her. Hate is a heavy thing to carry. I simply accepted that love sometimes requires distance. That lesson took me longer to learn than almost any other. My sister completed everything the court required. The restitution, the probation, the community service. From what I heard, she also began making different choices. I genuinely hope that's true. Not because it changes what happened. Because every child deserves parents who understand accountability. Including hers. People sometimes expect stories like mine to end with revenge. They imagine dramatic confrontations, shouted apologies, someone begging for another chance. Life rarely works that way. The greatest victory wasn't watching someone else lose. It was watching my son stop believing he had to accept unfair treatment just to keep people happy. That was the moment I knew we had truly won. One evening not long ago, Caleb and I were putting away tools after another afternoon in the garage. He had grown taller. His voice had deepened. Sometimes I catch glimpses of Daniel in the way he smiles. He closed the toolbox and looked at me. Mom? Yes. I'm glad you didn't give up. I smiled. I thought you were talking about the sailboat. I wasn't. He leaned against the workbench. I mean, everything. His words stayed with me long after that conversation ended. Children don't remember every detail of difficult seasons. But they remember who stood beside them. They remember who made them feel safe. If there is one thing I hope Caleb carries into adulthood, it isn't the memory of an empty bedroom. It is the memory that someone loved him enough to protect his dignity. Even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. If you're listening to my story today, maybe you're carrying something similar. Maybe you've been told that keeping the peace matters more than telling the truth. Maybe you've spent years believing your role is to sacrifice while everyone else excuses their own choices. If that's you, I hope you remember this. Boundaries are not walls built to keep love out. They are doors that teach people how to enter your life with respect. You don't have to stop being kind. You don't have to stop forgiving. But forgiveness is strongest when it walks beside accountability instead of replacing it. That was the lesson my son and I learned together. And in the end, it became a far greater inheritance than any piece of furniture could ever have been. So now I'd love to hear from you. If someone in your own family crossed a line like this and then asked you to forgive them before they accepted responsibility, what would you have done? Where would you have drawn the line? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story may encourage someone else who feels completely alone today. And if stories about quiet courage, difficult choices, family betrayal, and hard-earned hope speak to your heart, I'd love for you to subscribe and join us. There are many more stories waiting to be told, and I'd be honored to have you here for the next one.